Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. How would you feel if your mother were about to marry Edgar Allan Poe? Well, we'll meet somebody who found herself in just that predicament on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, here she is. The one right here. This is Anne Elizabeth Shelton, the daughter of Elmira Royster Shelton, the only woman to whom Poe was engaged twice. Once before he went off to college, and her father broke that off while Poe was at school. And the other time when Poe was 40 years old. He was actually engaged to her at the time of his death. This was 1849. She's born in 1830, so she would have been 19 years old at the time. She was already married, she'd moved out of the house, but she knew of Poe's reputation, and she couldn't stand the guy. Part of it could be for financial reasons. She didn't want to lose part of her inheritance to this Edgar Poe, this struggling poet. But to be fair, nobody in Elmira's family liked Edgar. Her son couldn't stand him. Her brothers thought that Poe is only out to marry her for her money. Even Poe's good friend, John Hamilton Mackenzie, the guy he'd known since he was like 3 years old, one of his best friends in the world, stopped Elmira on the street and said, you can never be happy with this guy. He's unstable as water, that he's just going to spend your money and leave you brokenhearted, but that he can't help it. That's just his nature. And this is coming from somebody who really cared about Poe. But for her part, Elmira answered John that she didn't care if Poe spent all her money. She didn't care because she'd always loved him and she always would. And that's kind of Elmira's response to everybody in the family, including Anne Elizabeth over here, is that I don't care what you say, we're getting married. And Anne Elizabeth just apparently pleaded with her mother, please don't marry this creepy guy. She used to make fun of him behind Poe's back. There's stories of Elmira's 10-year-old son, imitating Poe's limp and goofing around behind his back while Anne Elizabeth giggled and said, stop that, I can't stop giggling. So the whole world seemed to be against Poe's relationship with Elmira Shelton. She was worth something like $100,000. She had a lot of rental properties on Church Hill. And so she was still generating income. She was a wealthy widow. She had no need to marry Poe for his money. He was struggling. He was barely making ends meet. So you can see why a lot of people thought, well, maybe it's about the money. For Poe's part, he was undecided. He was really in love with a lady called Annie Richmond who lived up in Lowell, Massachusetts, but he couldn't be with her because she's already married. But towards the end, he actually wrote to his mother-in-law and said, it's impossible for me not to love Elmira, considering that she loves me so wholeheartedly. And Poe scrimped and saved, and shortly before his death, he bought Elmira an engagement ring, which we actually have here at the Poe Museum. And here's a bonus for you. This is Anne Elizabeth in her later years. After she married a fellow named John Henry Leftwich and moved to Ashland, Virginia. And guess who has a portrait of John Henry Leftwich? Right there. Now, in her later years, Elmira was struggling financially and had to move in with Anne Elizabeth. And it's said that while Elmira was living there, Anne Elizabeth forbade her to even mention Edgar Allan Poe's name in the house. She still could not get over her hatred for Poe. And maybe it was Anne Elizabeth's loyalty to her father who'd passed away, or maybe it was something else. When Elmira finally passed away, 40 years after her engagement to Poe, her granddaughter, Anne Elizabeth's daughter, said that she never even knew about Poe's relationship with her grandmother, that that's how strong the bias against Poe was in that family. Now, Anne Elizabeth lived until 1909, so she would have lived long enough to see all the centennial exhibits and the statues to Poe going up around the country, and she would have realized that Poe was now regarded as a great writer, but I don't think she ever really forgave him for trying to marry her mother. So what do you think? Can you feel for old Anne Elizabeth Shelton here? How would you feel if this erratic, scandalous poet were trying to marry your mother? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like this photograph of Anne Elizabeth Shelton and her cousin Lucy Bohannon, standing there by the way, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org, or become a Poe Museum Patreon patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. And until next time, thanks for joining us. And I leave you with more gratuitous footage of Edgar the Poe Museum cat showing off his pretty new Halloween collar.